Carter, I think we've got a pretty good group if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, great. Well, welcome everybody and good evening in these unprecedented times with the election, with the coronavirus pandemic, everything all rolled together. I'm Carter C. Hudgens. I'm the president and CEO of Drayton Hall Preservation Trust, and it is nothing short of an honor to be with you this evening for this special preservation retrospective. And I should note that this is part of a two-day special workshop sponsored by Drayton Hall Preservation Trust and APT, the Association for Preservation Technology. Before turning things over to Trish, as we launch this special preservation retrospective, I want to offer sincere thanks to Glen Keys Architects for sponsoring this evening. Also to Trish and Matthew Sturger for their work as both directors and producers of what we're shortly going to experience. And last and not least, I want to offer my thanks to those of you who have preserved Drayton Hall over the last 40 plus years. And that goes to those of you that are preservationists and your many talents that have conserved and saved Drayton Hall, many of which you'll hear from tonight through interviews, as well as thanks to the friends of Drayton Hall, our members, and those that have supported Drayton Hall through philanthropy and quite honestly worked to help Drayton Hall survive to the present. I'd be remiss if I did not plug our membership program. If you're not a member and would like to help us further our work to protect Drayton Hall and advance our mission, please feel free to reach out to me, visit our website, www.draytonhall.org, or contact Haley Erickson, our Director of Philanthropy. But without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Patricia Trish Smith, Drayton Hall's Curator of Historic Architectural Resources, who has been quite a treasure and carries on the legacy of many of you that have worked on Drayton Hall over the years. So without further ado, Trish, I'm going to turn it over to you, which with this promises to be quite a special evening. So Trish, over to you.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Carter. Thank you all for being here tonight. I am just really excited for you to see this film. Many of the folks that you're going to see in this film tonight are on this meeting with us. And so I'm thrilled to see all of your faces here. So I'll just say, briefly by way of introduction, that at the beginning of this year, we wanted to kind of acknowledge that this year is the 40th year since the passing of Stephen Wood, who was an apprentice in the National Trust Restoration Workshop and did really tremendous work at Drayton Hall. And so we kind of had that in our minds. We wanted to mark this year, but in an educational way. And so we initially set out to do that by partnering with the Association for Preservation Technology to put on a workshop at Drayton Hall. We were going to have a preservation workshop. And as you all know, our plans had to change pretty significantly. Everyone's plans changed this year. And so the kind of workshop, sort of hands-on nerdy preservation stuff happens tomorrow in 3 sessions that many of you are signed up for tomorrow. But we also set out to talk to many of the preservationists that have worked at Drayton Hall in the last 40 years. And in my 10 years at Drayton Hall, many of these conversations were with people that I haven't met before, but I will just tell you that I've taken so much from this experience. And it's such a privilege to talk to the people who have been stewards of Drayton Hall, before me and my colleagues that you'll see in this video. So this all really has come together just in the last 3 months or so. The interviews that you'll see, we began in September. And I think we did our last interview maybe last week before last, something like that. So many, many thanks to our friend Matthew at MRF Visuals. He has a beautiful website if you want to see more of his work. What you are about to see is a compilation of recorded Zoom interviews that I then took transcripts, turned them over to Matthew, got together a bunch of photographs, and he turned it into something really beautiful. I will maybe remind you that this film is a product of its time. these are Zoom interviews. I think we all have enough experience with Zoom now to know that sometimes there's a little lag, the video gets a little herky-jerky. If you see that happening, it is probably not your connection or my connection right now. It's probably just the quality of video that we were able to get. So hang in there with us. If it starts looking a little funky, just stick with us. It's probably going to be fine. So that being said, I'm going to get out of the way. I'll start the film. Just so you know, going in, the runtime is 1 hour and 26 minutes. I hope you will all be able to stay with us for the whole thing. If not, I understand. We will find a way for you to see the rest of it. But if anyone wants to stick around afterwards and talk about the film, we're happy to do that too. But all that being said, I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go.
Drayton Hall was great because I did not have to get into debates about whether we're going to restore to this period or that period or what we're going to do, because the building was just telling us what we had to do. We're going to preserve it the way it is. We're going to save every piece of historic fabric.
When Drayton Hall was first opened, and now that's become the norm. Like how you started is now really the direction that historic houses are going, such as President Lincoln's Cottage, where it doesn't have a collection, and it's known because of the power of the narrative that you go in and you can talk about any issue you want to talk about that day, and the room allows you to do it.
That few sites quite have as pure as Drayton Hall. And that philosophy hadn't been put in concrete yet at the Trust.
I'd never been there before, and I remember coming down that drive, and all of a sudden that house, Drayton Hall, just kind of exploding out of the landscape, and just being in awe.
Every time I go back, there's a new project like the Portico project that opened up all sorts of areas to look at. I just think the building, inside and out, has this extraordinary level of physical evidence that I think each project builds on the next one.
And I remember getting a cup of coffee that tasted like sulfur water. It was really bad, but in a way it was really good too, because everybody was friendly and they gave it to me, and it was, the conversation was good. So.
I'm Tony Wood. I'm Stephen Wood's brother, and grew up with memories on 7th Street in Charleston, Illinois, with Peter Cook being a student of my father's, who would, I think you were staying with us maybe, but Peter was very much I remember being in charge of his kids on a number of occasions, displaying cooking skills that involved hot dogs and cheese. I remember that. My association began with Drayton Hall with Steve's death back in 1980, and then got seriously connected in 2000 when George McDaniel ultimately invited me to come on the site council. He had helped organize an event, memorial event for my brother on the 20th anniversary of the accident. I'd kind of reached out to kind of see if we could stir something up, and George was wonderfully responsive. So I was then on the site council for a number of years, and then became chair. And then as the site council morphed into its own 501c3, the Drayton Hall Preservation Trust, I moved on to that board.
My name is Peter Cook, and I'm recording this from our home in rural Maine, York County, Maine. But my story with the Wood family and historic preservation goes back almost 60 years, when I was an undergraduate student at Eastern Illinois University. It was at that time I was studying with Tony's father, who was Dr. Leonard Wood, and I was invited to the Wood home for dinner and to use Dr. Wood's library for research. And I love to say the story. The way my story goes is I went for dinner and stayed for 5 years. A wonderful beginning memory with Stephen was he was so serious about the Civil War. And he was always looking for time when we could go sit on the front porch and swing and talk about the Civil War. And he would relate all the different battles. He was way ahead of me. He was quite a precocious student. But I mean, he must have been 10, or he was an emerging adolescent at best. And he was just a font of information about the Civil War and felt that he needed to ventilate his intellect at all appropriate times and sometimes inappropriate times.
Hey, Trish, I think I sent you a copy of a letter he wrote as a small kid, I think, to the Civil War Times as a young subscriber. So he was indeed serious. You're right, Peter. He subscribed to that, and I can't even remember the content of the short note, but it was, I don't know, being a reader, he was logging in or something at the what age.
Yeah.
My dad was a history professor, so history and current events were things that were always being kind of talked about at the home. And then Mom was running, had started this independent bookstore, whose business model we learned later was public service on private capital. Never made any money. Ultimately, when we had to sell it, when somebody asked to see the profit and loss statement, we knew they weren't a serious buyer, because there was never a profit statement, just a loss. But Peter, you helped run the bookstore, and as kids, Steve and I would run the bookstore, would have our hours and surrounded by books, and not having a lot of customers, one got to do a lot of reading.
And Stephen remembered those looking at architecture, even at that age, when, if we fast forward to when he stayed with us in Vermont, and this is many years later, when he had gone through college and had started pointing his career toward history in terms of restoration. I know he spent a couple of years out in California. I think it was in the San Diego area.
San Diego.
But when he came back, we kind of put together a job for him in Vermont when I was living in Vermont at the time. But Stephen came out and worked for me at the Peter Madison Tavern, which had suffered a fire during the bicentennial year. You don't burn your museum during the bicentennial year. And I was so thrilled that he came east, because he was following my footsteps in terms of, I didn't realize how much original architectural fabric and history was available in New England, because I was a Midwesterner. And when I moved out a few years before, I said, oh my gosh, this is a rich dessert. And I was so eager for Stephen to come, because he was very interested in architectural history as well as construction methods. And when he came out, he was just as dumbfounded as I was. When I took him up and down the roads, and we had look at early buildings, not only colonial, but Italianate and Greek Revival and so on. And he just loved it. And I loved him loving it. So,
Peter, when you spent a lot, actually more time talking with him at that point in his life than I probably did. How did I was always fascinated by the fact he wanted to go to the hands-on craftsman piece of preservation, because after U of I, he went to San Diego. He was going to go to graduate school, found that the courses didn't match his interests at all, and then ended up getting involved in construction and painting out there. And when that didn't, I guess, fulfill what he wanted, he then ended up heading east and hooking up with you. But did he ever explain why the hands-on particular interest in the craftsman approach?
I think that the seed was probably planted when he got involved in construction and so on in California. I mean, he was learning methods of carpentry, but he found himself wanting more, and he was very interested in the historic level of that. And those two needed to come together, and he knew that he needed to move back east. And I have an artifact this morning to show you, if you can still look at my screen right now. This is Steve's tool belt that he used at Drayton Hall and probably at the Peter Madison Tavern. But his mother, Tanya, gave it to me at Stephen's service, and I've kept it all the time. It's our little reminder, our little family artifact that reminds us that Stephen was a woodworker and a dear friend and a part of our family. And it was along in that period of time that Stephen found out about the apprenticeship program, which I believe he began at Chesterwood.
You know, the home base for the apprenticeship program was a Lyndhurst at Tarrytown, and then they would be kind of farmed. I always said they did the trust laundry. They'd be sent to whichever trust property had a project that they were able to do with the guidance of their senior craft person.
When I became a part of SBNEA, when it was an administrator on that, we had 65 different sites. But in spite of that, I was invited by Boston University to become an adjunct associate professor there in the preservation program as well as the art history program. And I taught curatorship and so on. I was on the adjunct faculty for about 8 years. But when I was teaching those courses, I kept thinking, you know, this is the other side of what Stephen should be doing. I mean, there was so much rich material that I was being exposed to, meaning my students and my colleagues. And I kept thinking, maybe this is the kind of, if he wants to do advanced study, this would be a great arena for him to pursue. But it became very clear to me very soon after those kinds of thoughts. And I had corresponded with Stephen about, you know, all the rich opportunities around. I was very much bragging about New England. But it became very clear to me that he was very, very happy where he was with his hands-on involvement.
That's a really interesting point that you raised, Peter, because I've been thinking about that a lot, that, you know, you say he was such a reader and a scholar and liked to talk about, you know, what he was learning and liked to engage with people about things. It sounds like he was kind of a natural educator. And so as I've been listening to you talk, I've just been wondering, how long would he have been content to kind of be left alone to work on projects and not really be able to engage with people about them? Because you can see him doing that in his day book even. He's really thinking through things and kind of writing down his thoughts about them. And
well,
yeah, do you have a sense of what, you know, if he would have been content to
I think he would have
working
flourished.
that way?
Yeah, there's, you know, all three planes. One is the, you know, his hands-on doing very sensitive work with wood, and you know, and contributing to the restoration or, you know, conserving historic buildings. So that's one side of it. The other side is Stephen was a scholar, and you look at his day books. I mean, this is not a casual carpenter. This is somebody that's analyzing his day, each day, and you know, writing things down. And he refers to different in those writings. You know, he refers to what he learned and his reaction to. I remember one passage where he talked about how a previous carpenter's work was covered up by stucco. Somebody took shortcuts, which Stephen did not approve of. So when they took away the stucco, no, we're going to do this right. The focus that Stephen had and the way he wrote up his work every day, that was so impressive. And you know, be a pretty cerebral carpenter. And then the third part of it is that Stephen's enthusiasm for his work was contagious. I've often thought about that. I've sat on the bench that is memorialized with Stephen at Drayton Hall several times when I visited Drayton Hall. I'd sit on that bench and wonder just what Stephen, how he would have, if he made a whole career out of Drayton Hall. He loved the building. I'm not sure how well he would have adjusted to be transferred to another site to do meaningful work, but he loved that building.
Steve and I, when we would talk about Drayton Hall and his work, was particularly passionate and committed to that Drayton Hall should keep to the preservation philosophy that the trust had kind of, and I think at that time had just kind of embraced. I think there'd been a national panel that would help the trust figure out, what do you do with Drayton Hall? Do you take it to a certain moment in time? Do you restore this? Do you take off the shingles that are the Victorian shingles? And he was adamant that he felt the philosophy of keeping the building the way it was when the trust received it, in that really pristine state, never having had electricity put in, never having plumbing, not having a lot of fresh paint used over the years. That was what really made it so special. And he was very committed to it. And it was an issue. It hadn't been solidified. It hadn't been, I think it was still new, and it was so different in terms of how people approached historic buildings at that time that he really worried that it was in jeopardy. And so kind of keeping it intact and defending that was, in a sense, so I took that to me to be kind of the legacy of his that I wanted to help advance in my involvement with Drayton Hall, was to make sure we kept true to that original vision that was the trust had for it and that he had for Drayton Hall.
So another thing that I'm curious about, since you were talking about how strongly Stephen felt about the preservation philosophy at Drayton Hall, is whether or not you think he was becoming an evangelist for that kind of philosophy across all historic sites, or if he just really felt like specifically for Drayton Hall that was the most appropriate approach.
This is all idle speculation. I because of his, as Peter said, his being a scholar and a research kind of driven person, I think he would lean towards wanting to, protect original fabric, but I think he would also be site specific. I think he'd want to know the history of the site and what had happened to it to guide what he felt was appropriate to the site. But I'm just speculating. Peter, you might have had more conversations.
I think that's a very interesting point. It has to be speculation, certainly. But I do remember very specifically thinking, gee, I wish Stephen could attend some conferences like APT or some on restoration, because not only I'd be very interested in what he would learn, and he didn't go to too many conferences, at least that I know of, but not only would he glean from it, but how would he inject himself into the conversation?
Yeah.
That's something that I would love to know.
I mean, he was early enough in his, kind of official preservation career that, I don't think he had the opportunities at that point in his career to go to APT or even the National Trust conferences. I just, certainly the National Trust conferences wouldn't programmatically had done much at that point around what he was most interested in terms of restoration. But APT, I think, Peter, it's great. I mean, if one could parachute him into kind of the community, the preservation community that exists today with the resources, et cetera. I mean, I could see him having, I mean, it's where would the career have gone? My mom and dad were very charitable, but not in a structured way. So they weren't giving to a lot of official nonprofits, but they were always helping people out or, involved with some nonprofit activity. And I remember, having some conversations with my dad about wanting to do something for Drayton Hall. And that never got anywhere. And there weren't like piles of capital lying around Cold Comfort Farm either. But I mean, but I just felt we should do something. So then when they died, it seemed it was kind of this was the best way to tie a lot of family things together, because they cared about Drayton Hall because of Steve. And so it's interesting to the real credit of the folks at the Trust's, development wing or what, but I went to them with this idea and I said, I really like to do this. I said, but I can't, the Trust needed it to be, I think, $100,000 to make it a permanent thing. And that wasn't what I was able to scrounge together. And so I thought, well, maybe we'll just have to wait till I pass away. And the Trust advisor said, well, no, they said, why don't we just start this with the money you've got? Because then you can kind of see it begin to unfold. And so we did. The initial money was put in, and fortunately, working at a foundation, I keep it as a well-kept secret, but I do have a very small amount of discretionary money. So I've been able to kind of put that in to the fellowship to kind of keep it from whittling its way down, right, through operations. Yeah. So we've been able to kind of sustain it over all these years. And my goal was, I mean, I certainly had incredible internship and fellowship experiences. I mean, they just are so valuable to people. And Steve was obviously getting so much out of the apprenticeship program that, creating a position at Drayton Hall for a younger person to have that experience made a lot of sense. But my number one desire was not to make it so rigid. It needed to also serve the needs of Drayton Hall. And so over the years, I never imagined it would become a full employment program for Drayton Hall. And so many people who would be introduced to Drayton Hall through the Wood Family Fellowship would end up becoming permanent members of the staff. But if my memory is right, that's how Carter got involved, you got involved. And so it's been a wonderful recruitment device, I guess, for Drayton Hall. And as a result, has had even a larger impact than I imagined. I imagined that that the products of what the fellows would do would be of value to Drayton Hall, and then they would probably go off and contribute something to the larger field. But the fact that they've also been able to stay and add so much intellectual capital to Drayton Hall has been like extremely rewarding. So it's like the most rewarding personal philanthropy thing I've been involved with. And one of my ongoing interests is trying to document, and this is why I'm so excited about what Trish is doing now, is documenting what I call the modern history of Drayton Hall. I mean, the history of Drayton Hall since it became a historic site. So, I mean, so many people, so much attention is focused appropriately on the Draytons and who built it and who lived there. But these sites don't take care of themselves. There's a whole preservation history. And that's what I think we could potentially lose, because it isn't the founding story, but it's, to me, as a preservationist, hugely important to document the story of how a site has been taken care of. And so, Trish, focusing on my brother's legacy obviously is just, bullseye for that.
I went to work for the National Trust in 1971, but I did not become an archaeologist for the Trust until 1974, and that's when I went to Drayton Hall. It was absolutely magical. I fell in love with Drayton Hall right then and there, and that's never changed. Spanish moss was just, like you see in the older photographs, just draped everywhere. Everything was overgrown. You couldn't see Drayton Hall until you were almost on top of it. So you go down this green alley, even in November, and all of a sudden this thing, a magnificent house, rises up and you see it. And it was an impression that I had all these years later have never, ever forgotten.
After I got out of the Air Force in 1973, I was hired by the National Trust to create and run the Restoration Workshop Apprentice Training Program, which was headquartered up at Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, New York. And I did that for 10 years. I was just intrigued by the concept of preserving it the way it is. Of course, not letting it deteriorate anymore and stabilizing it so it stays safe. But I had never worked in a house like that before, and it really is kind of otherworldly, I think Lynn said, to walk into this vacant space that was really cool, what can I say?
Well, the first time I saw Drayton Hall was 1978. I was there as a tourist. I had taken the family down on a first-time visit to the Eastern Seaboard meccas of Savannah, Charleston, and places like that. And I knew of Drayton Hall because the trust architect at the time, Nat Nevlet, was a former colleague in the firm we used to work at together in Alexandria. And he lived in Washington, so we communicated frequently. And I was aware of the importance, and B, the issues that began to emerge with respect to how to conserve and treat it. So I was anxious to see it for the first time. I did see it. I came down the alley as Lynn described, and at that moment, wow, I knew it was where I wanted to be, but they chased me away because it wasn't open at that time. So I had to wait for 2 years until I began my employment with the trust in 1980. At the time, the National Park Service had a program of preservation grants to institutions and properties, which was our lifeblood in being able to begin this work. And they also supported the National Trust project of the Restoration Workshop, recognizing the need to educate and train skilled craftspeople in the preservation arts. not that it was impossible to find craftsmen, but to train young people to carry on and to put their work right to work, literally at our own properties, was a scheme that the Park Service supported. And we had money, we had people, and we had needs. And part of my responsibility in that period, I'll just briefly say, was to ensure, to the greatest of my ability, the continuation of the restoration workshop. By the mid to late 80s, we were losing federal funding. And that whole issue contributed negatively to the long-term existence of the workshop.
I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes, starting the preservation issue, whether preserve as is or restore.
The impact of Drayton Hall is based on two things. One is the conceptual, as your documentaries and videos that I saw over the last few days have said. It is an absolutely marvelous example of Palladianism in America, and one of the first. That whole philosophical design trend and body of knowledge and practice, it started then. And that's an incredible, documented, important thing to be aware of and to understand it. The other is, as Lynn said, the document that the house represented was so rich in so many ways, in every aspect of architecture, construction, materials, taste, wealth, society. It was an incredible document waiting to be read. And we were just there at the beginning as the pages were starting to unfold. And that's what led to this protective shell, this precocious kind of, we've got to not let anything happen to it, because the story is going to take some time to evolve, and it has. So I think the seriousness of it was understood by staff. I fully understand, as Lynn referred to, the impetus to do the other side of house preservation, show the grandeur, show the glory, show the taste, the fabrics, the furnishing, yada, 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 all good, but that would have obscured the architectural significance and our ability, and the public's ability, to read and understand and hopefully appreciate it. That document is rare, essential, and everything you do to understand every inch of it is the way to go.
I think one of the most exciting projects, maybe this is in retrospect, was when we kept having archaeological accidents. This happens at all our sites, not just Drayton Hall. And John Kidder calls me up and says, "Oops, Lynn, we put our ditch witch through a site." And so I hustled down there with my crew. And this was off the north facade, and started digging and excavating. This pile of bricks had been found. And what we ultimately found was remnants of the pre-Drayton Hall house. And I think that was really, really exciting. We knew it was over there because we had indications of it when we excavated the north flanker. But this was actually like a pier from that house, plus all the early 18th century artifacts that we found associated with it. It just was very, very exciting.
There were all different kinds of preservation philosophies: preservation, restoration, blah, 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 reinterpretation. But I was working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So I thought my job was to be a steward of help to be a steward of the property and preserve it for the future. Drayton Hall was great because I did not have to get into debates about whether we're going to restore to this period or that period or what we're going to do, because the building was just telling us what we had to do. We're going to preserve it the way it is. We're going to save every piece of historic fabric. You know, we were state of the art in terms of what we did on the ceiling for that time. Morgan Phillips figured out the composition of the materials we should use. Jack Waite was an architect of some stature in the restoration world. So we did all the projects. You know, we took up the floorboards, poured in the plaster, did the securing it as best as we were instructed to. Put the floorboards all back in the same place. Just be careful not to destroy them. And but the interesting thing was we had to support the ceiling from below because it was very fragile. The way you did it in 2001 was much more sophisticated than what would be done by normally country carpenters. So we supported it, and we needed to pad the ceiling, so we didn't want to destroy it. So somebody went out and got a whole bunch of remnant rugs, and we used those and they did a good job doing that. But when it came time to take it down, I did get a kind of a frantic call from, I don't know whether it was John or somebody else, because being Northerners, we didn't realize that things grow, all kinds of things down in the South. So when we took down the rugs, the ceiling was now multicolored with different kinds of mold, fungi, and whatever else. And fortunately, the gentleman, Norman Weiss, who was running the Columbia program at that time, I called him in panic because I didn't know anything about chemistry. And he recommended, I think it was something over-the-counter solution. We just sprayed it on. Everything turned white again. And we learned a valuable lesson that we had to worry about the climate. Oh, now they would say I was drinking the Kool-Aid, but I think we had the right approach, and Rich is right. We did bring in experts from Columbia and other places, and people to do demonstrations of how to do one-on-one plaster, how to do stair building. And, I met some really tremendous people during that that were involved with preservation in that period. Don Streeter, who was doing all the restoration hardware for Independence Hall and other places, and so on. Learned a lot from those folks. It's helped me in a lot of other ways.
The relationship between archaeology and the preservation workshop was always not only cordial and friendly, but also fruitful. We would inform each other on certain things. For instance, we had an early indication of the slate roof that had been on Drayton Hall before people got actually up in there, because we were finding slate, pieces of slate. It wasn't until later that we found whole slates. Also, roofing nails, the brass nails that were used to hold the slate in place. It's just one example. Lightning rod, we found a lightning rod ground. When we got to Drayton Hall, and for many years thereafter, there was no indication of lightning rod there, but we were able, so the interplay, not just the workshop itself, but between, and I know Rich and I always work this way too, the interplay between the architecture and the preservation architecture and archaeology was always a very fruitful relationship, which kind of explains why I'm here. It's an old saw now, but at the time we were doing it, the multidisciplinary approach was kind of a new concept.
It's hard to be consistent. I can quote the wise guy who said, "Foolish consistency is a hobgoblin of small minds." So you have to make exceptions to make things work in a sensible way.
Well, to follow on something Alan said earlier, he said the building was telling him what to do. I have followed that process in my work as an architect. The building is my client first. It tells me what to do, and then I have to convince the owner. But it's the relationship with the architecture that it transcends just building and bricks. Our responsibility as professionals is to make this thing work and survive. And whatever it takes, talking to buildings is not just for the Looney Tunes. So I did it all the time.
Hi, I'm Barney Fix. I live in Spokane, Washington. In 1978, I was part of the National Trust Restoration Workshop out of Tarrytown, New York, and it was an apprenticeship program. And we did a 4 or 5 month stabilization job of the decorative plaster ceilings at Drayton Hall. And I was part of that group, and hopefully the ceilings haven't fallen down since.
I'm Marcia Rooney. I'm Barney Fix's wife. I spent about 40 years in the museum field, so I have a lot of interest in the architecture and preservation aspects too. I also worked at Plymouth Plantation with Barney when we were raising some of the buildings there. And my story about Drayton Hall is kind of interesting because my first museum conference was in Charleston, South Carolina. And we drove down from Long Island to South Carolina to this conference. And I believe it was in 1977. And that was my visit to Drayton Hall, my only visit. And Barney wasn't there then, so I just saw it as a tourist. But it's one of the best tours I've ever had because it wasn't fully, filled with furniture and all of that kind of thing. But the guide used the architecture to tell the story of how the rooms were used, et cetera. And it was just like word pictures. It was so beautifully done that you didn't miss seeing all of the things that would have been there. You could see them in your imagination.
Did you know Stephen Wood?
Yeah. He was, I finished my apprenticeship in 79. He must have come in maybe early 79 or something. I never had him on a job. Steve was an interesting guy. He was very boisterous and confident, and he was a character. There's no doubt about it. So yeah, I actually knew him, pretty well. Like I say, I was on jobs mostly with Wayne Tristler. We seemed to do quite a few jobs together, Bell Grove and stuff like that. So, Steve was a crazy man. So yeah, interesting guy. Yeah, I think his father was a history professor, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And I remember meeting his brother Tony they had I wouldn't call it a funeral, but a service in Vermont. So we got to meet the family and things like that. But he apparently was getting quite good at the masonry stuff. I think that was kind of his focus. I could be wrong, but Alan would know on that too. So yeah.
Do you have like a story that kind of sticks out in your mind about Stephen that would kind
Probably not for
publication.
For publication.
No.
Well, this is 1979. Were you born then? Anyway, we had high inflation and unemployment at that time, and I think Massachusetts unemployment was like 14% or something. So I did off and on jobs. I remember getting with people just out of the newspaper, and then I just started my own business. I figured, what the heck? My mentor at the trust Alan was the administrator, but the carpenter was Joe Lewis. He had been trained in England in the 1930s and an apprenticeship type of thing. And so he was a carpenter, but also he was a cabinet maker too. He had his own business in New York City for many, many years. And so his best advice he ever gave me was, he says, never turn down a job. And then also do all kinds of work, because he says if things slow down, if you're just a framer or you're just a plaster or a mason or whatever, you always have work to do. And I took that to heart. See, the whole gist of it was to adhere the new plaster to the old plaster. I remember checking all those keys. We'd have to physically touch them to make sure they weren't somewhat loose. If they're loose, then we took them out. This was the biggest pain in the ass job, cleaning. It was. I still remember that. It was, literally, what was interesting is the guys that were working on this and with the shop, Alan and Joe and Ted Ewing before Joe was a master carpenter, and they really stressed the quality work. Left to right is Doug Clinton, who was the Waits project manager. and then myself, and then Stu Williamson, and then Jack Waite, and then Wayne Tristler, and then John Mark Garrison. Every day we seem to learn something about the building and talking about, like I say, people were intellectually interested in historic buildings and historic building, but also the mindset of the craftsmen or the workmen who were doing this too. And I'm still interested in that. You know, some guys are really crappy and some guys are really good. You know, just because it's old doesn't mean it's well built. So the other thing that the workshop did, it was talked about different types of philosophies of preservation. And that was really important. Even today, if I'm just doing a general job on a house, I try to save as much as material as I can. It doesn't take that much longer to work with it instead of just ripping out stuff. So that continues to carry through with me. And then also I'm a big proponent of not restoring houses, is to preserving what you have, because it's the history of the house. You know, I use people's age to talk about changes in a building, your personal, human age, in terms of you change, things happen, you limp a little more, you kind of bend over and stuff like that. And I said, buildings go through the same thing. Yeah. And we don't want to change that, because that's the character of the building. That's their story.
I'm John Kidder. I started working at Drayton Hall when I was at the College of Charleston, right after I got out of the service. I was commuting back and forth between the College of Charleston and Drayton Hall. I was doing maintenance for about 3.5 years, 3 years, as a just laborer. I left when I graduated from the college, and I remember getting a cup of coffee that tasted like sulfur water. It was really bad, but in a way it was really good too, because everybody was friendly and they gave it to me, and it was, the conversation was good. So yeah, those are a couple of my first memories. Driving up the avenue, I thought it was an amazing thing to drive down 61 and then turn right. And at 61 at that time, the oaks were awesome. But when you turned on to Drayton Hall, the oaks were like even more spectacular. Anyway, and it was like overgrown everywhere, but it was still very cool. It was like driving into an old movie set or something, I guess. Those are my impressions. I just thought, wow, this would be a really cool place to work. I had worked construction before when I was in high school and stuff, but construction is not historic preservation, as you well know.
Yes.
It's totally, it's two separate ends of the bell curve. The old superintendent named Stan Betzold was retiring or took another job at Deweese Island, and called me and told me that he was leaving. The former director, Letitia Galbraith, called me and asked me to apply. So I did, and interviewed, and I started back at Drayton Hall in November, I think, of 1982, and worked until the stock market crash recession of 2008 and 9. My last day was my birthday, July 19, 2009. Hugo is the biggest sort of endeavor that occurred during my tenure. The most disappointing was also Hugo, because the barn that is down by the river got picked up and dropped down and pretty much destroyed what we were hoping would be a rustic place for education programs to occur. And it would have been, if we had been able to finish, we were almost there too. In fact, one of the reasons it fell was because we were taking the supports off the week before. So a lot of the bracing that we had that might have let it survive, we had removed because we were getting ready to put in permanent posts. Anyway, but Hugo came right on time and destroyed that idea. There were very few people that actually did preservation work, as their bread and butter. In fact, David Hoffman was really the only one I knew who did preservation work as that was his trade. Like Moby Marks or like Richard Marks now that's his thing now, but we weren't blessed with Richard Marks in those days. And I kind of wish that we had been a little more scholarly about that, I guess. Not necessarily the maintenance department, but researching. Well, and us, me too, as well. A little more scholarly about our approach and trying to figure out how the other half lived, quote unquote. What life was like. We tried, and Dr. McDaniel, I give him credit for putting a lot of the focus on the African American cemetery and on making sure that there was plenty of opportunity for Mr. Bowens to get his memories on the record, and Mr. Bowens' family. And we had the family reunions and tried our best, I guess, to get as much information as possible. But I just wish it would have been a little bit more. We would know more. I wish there was more knowledge about names and lifestyles and how they spent their day and how did Toby spend his day. That's kind of those kinds of questions were intriguing to me more than I should shoot myself for that. No, more frankly than the house and the architecture, because it's extant and everybody can see it, and everybody can draw their conclusions. Do they like the brackets under the stairs, or do they like, or the colors, all that. That's all extant and right there in front of you. And the things that you can't see are the things that are, like everywhere else in life, are the things that are most important. The legacy of Mr. Bowens and the legacy of the community that lived on the high ground, and the way that sort of off the main road commerce route worked always intrigued me, and I don't think we spent near enough time trying to figure it out. Yeah, it's been a while. I go there and I this is gonna sound corny, but I really have a hard time going there. I have a hard time driving down Ash River Road. I have a hard time.
Because you have a lot of memories.
Yeah, I do. I love Drayton, and I loved all the people.
Well, I'm Susan Buck. I am a conservator, an art conservator, and a paint analyst. And most of my work over the last couple decades has focused on architecture, although I was trained as a furniture conservator in the Masters of Science program at the Winterthur University of Delaware. It was my first time, and I remember driving up the road. The doors were open. I could see through the building, and I just thought it was magical. And for someone focused on architectural paints, the interior was just so exciting. Like, no one had really studied the paints in the building. There'd been a lot of concern about it and a lot of speculation about what the colors had been, but nobody had really looked hard at those paints. My first involvement came in 2001, about 10 years after I'd gotten out of graduate school. And it was the perfect application of this type of work. In other words, we were looking at the interior coatings of the building to try to figure out why the paints were so fragile and flaking so consistently, with flakes on every floor of every room. And clearly cleavage between the layers as well. How can we slow this process down? Because one of the evocative parts of walking into Drayton Hall is seeing these incredible preserved surfaces. So aged paints that clearly date to its use by the Drayton family. And I every time I go to Drayton Hall now, I check to see how many flakes are on the floor. And there are some, but it's not like it's raining paint flakes. And so I strongly believe that this has really saved the paints on the interior. Without this, we'd probably see 50% less of the painted surface at this point. And that was the goal, not to have a permanent intervention, but to very much slow this process, this natural process of aging and degradation. Every time I go back, there's a new project like the Portico project that opened up all sorts of areas to look at that we didn't have access before, and told us more about the conformation of the portico and the painted wooden elements that are, part of the cornice that nobody had ever seen. And yeah, I just think the building, inside and out, has this extraordinary level of physical evidence that I think each project builds on the next one.
If Drayton Hall was in the business of restoring our interiors instead of just conserving them,
yeah,
how would we approach our walls? If we wanted
I don't even want to go there. Well, okay, so here's what I would say. First of all, you would leave all the paints there. You wouldn't do any paint stripping. That paint is evidence for the next generation or the generation after that, who's going to be doing more research with better technology, with greater understanding of context. Every time I came back, we were trying to answer different questions. And that to me is like what gives the building so much vitality. We just keep learning more. So my feeling is that we still have more to learn.
I'm Ashley Wilson. I'm the Graham Gunn Architect of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is an endowed position that was set up to help do broad oversight to all of the National Trust properties that we own, including Drayton Hall.
My name is Matt Webster. I'm currently the Executive Director of Architectural Preservation and Research at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation in Virginia. I was at Drayton Hall for several years, and I was the Director of Preservation during that time.
I am positive I was an 8 to 10-year-old kid. So I came when I was really little on a family trip, and being the preservation dork that I was predestined to be, I was, I thought I had gone to Europe. I don't think I even knew I was still in the United States. I was overwhelmed at what a beautiful house it was and what a beautiful place it was. It's just a little kid.
My first time coming to Drayton Hall, I think it was about 15 years ago. I'd never been there before. And I remember coming down that drive, and all of a sudden that house, Drayton Hall, just kind of exploding out of the landscape, and just being in awe of it. It was just this incredible place. I mean, even from afar, it just was amazing. There's houses out there that kind of, you have to tease the story out of, and this house just has so many stories and so many incredible stories to tell, and they just flowed out of every little crack and wall and surface.
I think Drayton Hall in the Historic House Museum canon, it was revolutionary because it was breaking barriers when it came out of the box, in the sense of like nobody had even thought of a house museum that came without a collection, and then actually displaying it without a collection, because at that time it was pretty typical. If you didn't have a collection, you would buy period appropriate pieces to put in the house so you can interpret it pretty tightly. And the fact that Drayton Hall didn't do it, it was, I'm sure people for 20, 30 years were still writing about like, what an unusual place to visit, because you have to go and travel in your mind. Like you have the space, but then it's your mind that has to envision how it was lived in. And what I find so fascinating is between when Drayton Hall was first opened, and now that's become the norm. Like how you started is now really the direction that historic houses are going, such as present Lincoln's Cottage, where it doesn't have a collection and it's known because of the power of the narrative that you go in and you can talk about any issue you want to talk about that day, and the room allows you to do it, and it provides flexibility. So now you are so cutting edge, and now you're sort of like, you know, led the pack. This is what everyone else is doing too. It's really, I think, how I expect to see historic houses as they come online. If we have more coming online in the future, they're going to be more of that model.
I know I do. I feel pressure every place I go, you know, to protect these places. But I think Drayton Hall, I think Drayton Hall's a little bit different because of the Drayton story, the Drayton family story, and in particular, you know, that at that time Charlie was still alive. You can connect to the family in a way that you don't really at other sites. So yeah, so there's a lot of pressure, I think, and a lot of, you know, what I found is there were a lot of unknowns that I was faced with, because here's a house that you're trying to preserve as is. So you're trying to, in some cases, keep things, freeze things in even a state of deterioration, so you don't change anything. And how do you do that? I mean, that's incredibly difficult, and you have to be so careful, as you well know, with every decision you make. It doesn't have an environmental control system. So a lot of the techniques used at Drayton Hall are used in museum houses that have environmental control systems, where you have materials moving at much different rates. Drayton Hall has more people that go through it just through visitation in a single year than it had go through probably in its entire 18th century life. So that wear and tear too, really, it changes the game a little bit.
The house really makes you contemplate the whole concept of authenticity and how it's almost a mirage. That for us at Drayton Hall, we basically tried to go back to like, well, we're just not going to add more changes. But in spite of that, you know, every intervention is a change, and every intervention is sort of directing you on where it's going. So it has its own, and Trish, you and I have talked about sort of trying to document that as well. It has its own history of preservation. Like we can write a historic structures report just on the preservation history of Drayton Hall. And to go back and look at people like Frank Matera, go back and look at his career, like what was he thinking in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, as we try different things. And the portico was really fun because we looked at everything, right? We looked at every single way you could do it. And we ended up with sort of a meritage of some modern design and some historic design, and all of it, we hope, with what we knew at the time, the most appropriate, you know, non-invasive decisions you can make.
Everything we do is building off work that other people did. And yeah, it's a pretty incredible place. And I know it played a big role in shaping me and continues to do that today.
You know, as the country moves into a sort of wanting to go to historic sites to learn sort of a bigger story and a wider story and talk more about the people and all the different people who live in the building, the architecture, even though it's not the focus the way it was 30 years ago, where it was just very conservation focused, still has to be there to last because it provides the place to tell the story. And that the story is very flat if you don't have the buildings. Buildings are what makes it evocative, to know that the people that you're discussing their hands on the handrail and we're in that space. It's transformative. That's what transports you back in time in a way that you can get in no other way except by experiencing the place.
My name is George W. McDaniel, and I was executive director of Drayton Hall for 25 years, beginning in November of 1989, soon after Hugo, and then retired in 2015. And had heard of Drayton Hall and wanted to see what it was like, and came, and I'd heard from some other Charleston friends says, well, you can visit there, but it doesn't have any furniture. And I was trying to imagine visiting a historic house museum with nothing inside. And I was thinking of apartments or houses that we had moved, my wife and I had moved out of. And I look around at the bare walls and I think, how sterile is that? Because it's the furnishings just as your room with the bookshelves and the door with the curtain on it. All those things add life to a site, to a place. And so I was just thinking of plaster walls or whatever. I couldn't envision it. But anyway, I went and then went on a tour, and I was pleasantly surprised. It was principally an architectural tour at that time in 1983, and I found the guide whose name I don't remember, very knowledgeable, and so it was an informative architectural tour. I did ask about African American history, because it was architects. There was, I can't remember if there was no mention of African Americans. I can't remember, but I asked about it, and they said, "Well, you'll have to come back, and gatekeeper Richmond Bowens, and he's not here. It was on whatever day it was, and he was off that day. You have to come back another time." I thought, well, that's kind of bizarre, but also that was kind of typical of house museums at that time. So I was disappointed in that, and I asked where the slave quarters were and so forth. And they said, well, we don't know, but we think there's some quarters up there on the main when you came down the driveway of the entry lane. As you're coming down to the right, there's a dogwood tree. We think they're around there, but we don't know. And so it was very much of a one-sided presentation of history. There were those projects that I had to get people who had more expertise than I. And that's with the house. I knew that I could not preserve the house. I had to call on architects. I had to call on engineers. I had to call on that team to work together, and I would manage it. But they were the ones who principally did it. And then on the other side, there were those projects that I worked on, that weren't sort of in my scope of work, but that if they weren't done, they were irremediable. You can't go back. It's like going back to yesterday. You can't get yesterday's time back. It's gone. And within that, there are two. One is the oral histories that I did, and then two was the environmental work. And the oral histories that I've done were with Charles Drayton, with Richmond Bowens. And I was interested in that because that brought life to the site. Architecture is very important, but it was a lived in place. So how do you get that lived in quality and convey that to visitors so they not just see the architecture, which is spectacular, unique. I mean, very well. But how do you see these places lived in? And so Drayton Hall has a way of inspiring our better angels. Drayton Hall is a place that is special, and that one does not want to fail. One wants it to succeed in whatever endeavor it undertakes. Historic preservation often, well, in the past, has been perceived as preservation of buildings, preservation of structures. And there's a value to that. Buildings don't preserve buildings, people do. So people have to step up to preserve buildings. There's also a history to it, old place preservation, and that is historic preservation principally developed on the East Coast because one needed to save the monuments, the memorials, the Mount Vernons, the Monticellos, the colonial homes in Philadelphia or New England or in Charleston. They needed to be saved. And you could point to a house and you could argue when there's very little support for historic preservation, you could argue architectural significance. You could point to it, you could measure it, you could demonstrate why this is important critically, or something happened there, you know, for the National Register, all those things that, you know, what's its significance? You could argue that. You could, on the West Coast, environmental conservation developed. There's a Native American tradition there, but their buildings were not architecturally significant as we see it on the West Coast. So what on the West Coast became important were the Redwood Forest, the Grand Tetons, Yellowstone, those kind of Yosemite, those kind of grand natural places that weren't on the East Coast. And environmental conservation started on the West Coast. And as a result of that, there's this bifurcation in vision. Historic preservation over here, architectural preservation. Environmental conservation over here, natural. What we're faced with in the Low Country and elsewhere along the East Coast, more and more, but especially here in South Carolina, is that you can't divide the two. The landscape is not a natural landscape. It's not a Yosemite or Grand Tetons. It's been shaped by human beings since human beings were first here. There's always been this interaction between human beings and nature.
I'm Cameron Moon. I am the Assistant Curator of Historic Architectural Resources.
I am Carter Hudgens. I am currently the President and CEO of Drayton Hall Preservation Trust.
I am Sarah Stroud-Clark. I am now the Director of Museum Affairs at Drayton Hall.
Did you interact with Richmond Bowens?
I did. I think as an employee, the first summer that I would have been at Drayton Hall would have been 1996, I believe, 96 and 97. And at that point in time, I do remember Richmond Bowens sitting on the porch of the caretaker's cottage and interacting with guests and telling visitors about his time on site. I was lucky enough that I was offered the 2006 Wood Family Fellowship. And I was in the right place at the right time, not only for the offer of that position, which was temporary at the time, but this was a time shortly after Sally Reard had established the endowment for the benefit of Drayton Hall. And with that really did lead to staffing up across the board at Drayton Hall, and particularly the creation of the Preservation Department at the time. So when I was starting my fellowship, soon thereafter, Matt Webster, who is now at Colonial Williamsburg, started as the Director of Preservation at Drayton Hall. And the two of us, it was really a harmonious relationship in the sense that he was the building guy, knew the architecture, knew the preservation, and I was an archaeologist, knew the material culture, knew the methodologies of conducting archaeological excavations. And so in a sense, we dovetailed. And Matt, of course, had since moved on to Colonial Williamsburg. But again, as I moved into that Director of Preservation role and not necessarily being a bricks and mortar preservationist, was able to create that department and stock it with the staff that we have today. So Sarah starting off first as an archaeologist, Trish, Cameron, both of you all starting as interns, but then moving into fellowships and full-time positions. So it was an organic evolution, if you will, but I think a lot of it comes to the generosity of Sally Reard. And even though she was not able to see our successes, she has greatly contributed to where we are today as an organization and having the dedicated preservation staff on site to care for the building, care for the landscape, care for the collections.
Yeah, I guess I go back and forth. When I think about the portico, I guess it really did, because The house told us where the joists were, and the house told us that it probably had rotted out, so we needed to add some waterproofing. But yeah, I guess I keep thinking about the ceiling, the plaster ceiling in the Great Hall, and the removal of the summer beams, and we've talked about putting them back, but what that will do, the fact that it was probably built with a shallower depth than it needs to be. I guess that is the house speaking to us, but it is so complicated.
One way it could be speaking to us and saying, come on guys, you tried to repair this however many years ago, let's just fix it and put it to bed. Do it right, stop band-aiding it. What does that look like? I don't know, but is the house ready for a full-on repair rather than a patch here or there?
Yeah, well, and I haven't heard any resistance to that idea. I've shared that we've probably patched that ceiling together as many times as we can reasonably do that, and that it is probably time to be more aggressive. And I've just seen a lot of nodding heads. I think everyone's pretty clear that the house is now telling us it's probably enough. I think the challenge is, we have this great kind of legacy of research and experimentation too, and so I know at least part of me says maybe there's another way we haven't thought of yet. There's some new technique we haven't tried. So I don't know. It's part of the fun of working for Drayton Hall, right? It's a puzzle.
My favorite parts of working at Drayton Hall have been those forums when we get people together from so many different disciplines, just working out problems. I feel like just the collaboration and getting in the house and, we all talk through it, just listening. That's probably where I've learned the most. And I feel like that's just the most fun, is to get everyone together, looking at the building and talking these problems through.
I don't think that we would be where we are now as an institution without the collaboration of a long list of people at Colonial Williamsburg that have really helped us get to where we are. And that's just been a wonderful thing as a professional to get to have experienced as well.
Collaboration and partnerships have certainly contributed to the state of Drayton Hall right now, and I think it does bring up a much needed thank you to the many, many people that have worked on Drayton Hall over the years across many generations as well. And I think it's a gift that those that came before us and those that are working on Drayton Hall now are delivering to the next generation.
I'm Trish Smith. I'm the curator of historic architectural resources at Drayton Hall. My very first visit to Drayton Hall was in 2008 as a brand new graduate student, and there was a tropical storm that day, but we were scheduled to go to Drayton Hall and we went to Drayton Hall. So I actually don't remember much about the site that day. I just remember that there was a tropical storm, and that was alarming. My next visit to Drayton Hall was shortly thereafter. I was just a couple of weeks into graduate school, and I came out thinking I was there to try my hand at Portuguese paleography. I don't speak or read Portuguese at all, but I was willing to try to transcribe something. Thankfully, what they actually asked me to do was to scrub and sort artifacts with Sarah. So I ended up scrubbing artifacts for a while, and I did a research project and then my thesis work there and then a fellowship. And so I feel like I came in 2008 and I never left. Well, and in doing this work of reaching out to people that have done preservation at Drayton Hall in the last couple of decades, I realized how quickly those people become kind of an abstraction. I mean, so many of them are still around. I've had the chance to talk to them, but in my 10 years at Drayton Hall, this is the first time I've ever spoken to 90% of these, preservation professionals. And it's been so interesting to hear their concern, that just like us, they want to know, did I do a good job? How's it holding up? Would you do it differently now? And so it's been nice to be able to say, no, you're doing okay. Or, I hope someone says that to me in the future. The restoration workshop participants each were instructed to keep a day book while they were working on these sites. And so we have 2 of them now. And one of them does mention a woman named Dixie Keller, who was a member of the restoration workshop. Presumably she was one of the apprentices. And this particular entry mentions that she left due to sexism, and what a shame it was that she was leaving under those circumstances, because she was a really talented apprentice. And so just looking at the context of those entries, it looks like maybe that didn't happen, that didn't play out at Drayton Hall specifically. And I spoke to the person whose day book this entry appears in, and he said, his experience at Drayton Hall and the leadership that was there at the time, he feels pretty strongly that they would not have allowed that to go on if they knew it was happening. And so it's encouraging for me to hear that. But just thinking about, the time that these people were working at Drayton Hall and how attitudes were a little different, it's not shocking to hear that happened somewhere, even if it wasn't at Drayton Hall. And in speaking to some of the other women who worked at Drayton Hall in various capacities at that time, I think they did experience sexism, maybe not so overt, but, Lynn Lewis, the archaeologist, spoke to me about being the assistant archaeologist for years. She was the assistant to no one. She was the archaeologist for the National Trust, but her title was assistant for several years. And I am grateful now that I think we work in an environment and for an organization where that kind of thing doesn't have to be an issue. I don't want to speak for others, but I would feel very comfortable saying, no, I'm not the assistant. I'm the person in this role. I am not assisting someone. We can do better than that. That's not to say that we don't still face challenges as women in preservation. I've had experiences, Cameron, I know you've had experiences that should not have happened, but I think it's also clear that we've come a long way. And we have a way to go still, as women in preservation, things could be better, right? And the field as a whole, we could see more diversity, right? We're pretty white in this field, it would be nice to make space for more diversity in this field, to make sure that everybody feels comfortable coming to work and doing the work that we do together. It's been a real privilege to talk to people who were at Drayton Hall in those first years of trying to figure out our preservation philosophy, and initially to really fight for it and justify it. But now, it seems like it hasn't even been that long, but I feel like now we're in a position of not only trying to uphold it, but to interpret what that means with a house that is just changing. It's so dynamic. And so the really conservative approach that we committed to, 40-ish years ago is just not quite as straightforward as I think it seems on paper. And I think we really came to understand that really intensely during that portico project between 2011 and 2016. There were so many decisions that had to be made. And, some have said that the house just tells you what to do. And I guess to an extent it does, but gosh, we spent a lot of time debating and going back and forth about, what's the right thing to do, from one case to the next. And so I just keep thinking about this idea that if nothing else, we should do no harm. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we're left with. It's not always very clear what our preservation philosophy should mean and what's the right path. But we should at least know that we are doing no harm. And now I think we're in a position where some of the, parts of the building, earlier repairs, things that the Draytons did historically, some of those things are doing harm now. And so now we're in this awkward position of, having to decide, like, are they doing enough harm that we have to intervene? It's such an interesting and stressful time to be trying to preserve this place with our very unique philosophy. We've talked about trying to craft an official preservation philosophy that the Historic Architectural Resources Committee would officially adopt. And I think we could certainly take a stab at it. But sometimes I wonder if it wouldn't be better to just compile all of these versions that we have of that philosophy over the years and just keep referring back to that and reflecting on it as we move forward. Because I just have this hunch that the minute we put something down on paper, we're going to take on some project that will just confound us, and that philosophy somehow will still not fit or not be enough to tell us what's the appropriate path. Part of the reason that I'm so committed to convening these forums every time we take on a big new project, because I know that there's an international community watching what we do. And so whatever we do, someone is bound to disagree with. And I just want to make sure that every choice we make is defensible. It might not be right, but we should at least be able to articulate why we thought it was the best decision at the time. And the more minds you include in that process, the better. Stephen Wood's story is so integral to the story of preservation at Drayton Hall in two time periods, really. You can think about it in 1980 when Stephen was working on site, and then you can think about it today in terms of his legacy and his family's legacy with the Wood Family Fellowship. Stephen was part of the restoration workshop with the National Trust, and in early 1980 he came to Drayton Hall. He worked on several projects on site. He kept a daily log of his work, which is fascinating to be able to get a peek into his thinking and his challenges and the way he worked through things day by day. He did a lot of really good work on the main house that we can still see today. And you can walk up to Drayton Hall and see the mark that Stephen left on the house. Tragically, Stephen was killed at Drayton Hall in August of 1980. Stephen and Alan Kaiser were both on scaffolding on the south side of the house, and the scaffolding collapsed. And Alan survived the accident, but Stephen did not. Stephen's family remained very committed to Drayton Hall, and then sadly, his parents were killed in an accident in the 2000s. And so to kind of remember their legacy, their love for Drayton Hall and for historic preservation, Stephen's brother Tony decided to create the Wood Family Fellowship in 2005. And so I was a Wood Family Fellow. Carter Hudgens, our CEO, was a Wood Family Fellow. Sarah Stroud-Clark was a Wood Family Fellow. Cameron Moon is a Wood Family Fellow. And so I don't think Tony intended this to be the case, but essentially the Wood Family Fellowship has built the preservation department at Drayton Hall. And so all of us now are a part of this incredible legacy. And we can all kind of look back to Stephen and his example and his love for this place and the great care that he took, how thoughtful he was about his approach to this house and doing no harm and doing things the right way and the hard way because it was the right thing to do. I think about him constantly when I work. I know we all do. I thought a lot about what Stephen would have done in his preservation career, because just the little glimpses that I've had into his life and his preservation work, he seemed to be a very cerebral person. He was very thoughtful and studious, and he also really loved to work with his hands. And so I've asked his brother Tony and his friend Peter Cook about that. Do you think he would have been content to always be on a roof, repointing or, rebuilding something and kind of separate from the people and the conversation and the scholarship? Or would he at some point have wanted to pivot and take a different tack where he could really engage with people and have a discussion? It seems to me that this preservation philosophy that we have at Drayton Hall was such a good fit for someone as thoughtful as Stephen Wood, because you do have to be so careful and think so much about what you're doing and justify it and articulate it to other people. So I am really curious what that would have looked like for him 40 years on.
All right. Are we back?
We're back.
All right. Well, Trish, thank you. I think so much was captured in your final statements, and I couldn't be more appreciative of that. And I think the rest of the folks that are on the Zoom call would agree with that. Do want to offer congratulations, Trish, to you and Matthew. That was an incredible film. And thanks to everybody else on the call that provided the input, the information to make this possible. And I guess in summation, it's totally safe to say that we are all part of the fabric of Drayton Hall. And so my sincere thanks to everybody who has played a role in the preservation of Drayton Hall over the last 40 plus years. It's certainly a special place for us all. And I thank you all for your efforts, for your support collectively over those 40 plus years. We've nurtured, we've inspired not only the site, but generations to come. And I think that's the common theme with all of this is we can work to preserve a place, but it's ultimately about, and forgive me, it's ultimately about the generations to come that will carry our legacies forward and those like Stephen. So hats off to everybody. I sincerely appreciate everything that's taken place to preserve Drayton Hall and bring this message forward. I will cease with that, Trish. I know there might be questions that everybody has, but my final words, I think everybody on the call tonight has been an inspiration for all of us that have participated in the conservation, the preservation of Drayton Hall, and it's not over. We've got lots of work ahead of us. Those of you that have worked on old buildings, that own old buildings, our work is never done, and we can continue to learn from one another, and it's totally a building process. Without collaboration, without partnership, we would be nothing. And that's not only true for contemporary partnerships, but partnerships over generations. And we're all part of a very powerful legacy, and our work is not finished and will continue into the future. So thanks, everybody. And Trish, I will turn it over to you with the question and answer period.
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks, Carter. I realized now after the fact that I've seen this a couple times already, so I should.
I have not. That was the first time I've seen
I
it, so I'm pretty blown away. Thank you.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful. And I think one of the things that struck me in talking to everyone in these interviews is that clearly Drayton Hall really gets under your skin. You know, so many people have really special stories about, you know, your first visit there and how you'll never forget it. And if you've had the privilege of putting your hands on the building and leaving your own mark, it's just doubly under your skin, right? It's a tremendous responsibility and also a great privilege. And I learned so much talking to so many of the people that you heard from tonight. And many of them are still on the meeting with us. So if anyone wants to say hello or share another reflection, or if anyone has questions, don't be shy.
I would like to offer my thanks again to all of you at Drayton Hall Preservation Trust for the opportunity to be invited to participate in this incredible retrospective, to reconnect with some old and valued colleagues, and also to meet some new ones, even virtually. It's been a wonderful end to the story about Drayton Hall. I'm going to get back there someday. I don't know when, but I thank you again for that invitation. And I think Trish gets a special commendation for her ability to elicit such compelling and insightful statements from so many people. Great stories all, and I will appreciate and value those. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Something else that came out of all of this is that when it is safe to do so, we really need to get everybody to Drayton Hall. We all need to see each other in person and be nerds together in the building. And I'm looking forward to the day that we get to do that. I will make it happen.
I'd like to say thank you. This was absolutely wonderful. I was lucky enough to be a guide. I volunteered in 1988 and 89 when I was a pharmacy resident at MUSC. And I learned so much. You talk about, there was an Instagram post the other day where someone said, if you come visit Drayton Hall, you'll never forget it. And I was very tempted to respond and say, be a guide at Drayton Hall and it'll change your life, because it had such an impact on me. It was great training for my future career in lecturing as a professor, but it also just made me so invested in historical architecture. And my husband and I moved to Charlottesville, Virginia. We live in Keswick, just east of Charlottesville, and we own an old house. So it's stayed a big part of my life. And I go back to it every time we go to Charleston. We come down to visit friends. And I can't thank Drayton Hall enough for all it's meant in my life and all the wonderful people I work with. And I am so proud of this next generation and all that you've done. It's just really remarkable. So thank you so much.
Trish, I'd like to add my thanks to you and the effort you put into this. One of the things I hope it inspires for other sites is to realize the story of the stewardship of sites is a story that usually isn't told. And the fact that you were so committed to telling it is just absolutely wonderful. So I think, again, Drayton Hall is perhaps in a leadership role here in helping people appreciate the importance of the modern history of all these wonderful, great sites. So thanks again, Trish.
Tony? I have to say another huge thank you to Matthew Fike at MRF Visuals, because I really did just dump a bunch of interviews on him and some photographs, and he turned it into this. So his vision really helped here. It really helped this come together. And so we're very fortunate. Matthew's wife is Cameron Moon, who you saw, our assistant curator of historic architectural resources. And so Cameron also did a ton of work on this, also helping scrounge up photographs. So I don't want to not thank them loudly here. You know, I'll say, watching this come together, I would like to see this be like required onboarding material for future people. Maybe, you know, in my role, Cameron's role, like maybe anyone at Drayton Hall, because I feel like I have matured a lot just in the last, you know, 3 months, and hearing from all of these people and your experiences and your lessons learned. And I'll do my job much better now, you know, for having done this. So. All right. Anyone else want to say anything, or is everyone ready for dinner and cocktails?
I'm ready for cocktails.
Cocktails. I feel you.
Trish, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I just want to say that I sent Trish an email saying how important or how honored we were to work at Drayton Hall. And we were all in our 20s then. Now we're all in our 60s or 70s now. But everyone who worked there in our group, very, very honored, and the significance of working there too. And I forgot to tell Trish is the broken keys that we took out, everything we cleaned up, we didn't send to the trash. We actually dumped it on the property to keep it there. And then there was on the stairway platform, we opened that up, there was kind of a mixture of mud with the keys. And so we kept that. We had no idea what was going on there. We actually put that up in the attic in a box. And I asked her if she's ever come across that, because we probably didn't mark it. We probably told the site director that. But anyway, it's an experience that I carried today. It was very important. So I'm so happy that you've done this. It just shows people what people can do to save structures, important structures.
Trish?
Yeah.
I just want to say to everybody, this is Bill Bodine, and I'm fortunate enough to be the new board chair for Drayton Hall. That was so incredibly moving. I learned so much. Tony, we're so grateful for your brother. And I heard so many things that just echo everything that I feel about Drayton Hall. And I just wanted to say I'm grateful, and I'm grateful to all of you who have done this hard and wonderful work over the years, and continue to support Drayton Hall. So I just didn't want the moment to pass without saying something. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.
Trish, it's
Hi,
Lynn.
Lynn.
Hi, I'm hiding in the dark. I just wanted to say hi to all the folks I worked with there over the years that are tuned in, and some like Alan and Rich and I had a real good conversation doing this. I think this is wonderful. I'm sorry it looks like Tony's scooted, but I couldn't agree more with Tony about preserving the modern history, not just of Drayton Hall, but of all of our sites and all of our work. It's very important to leave something for those who come after. But it's good to see some faces that I haven't seen for quite a while. So hi to you all. I miss you.
We will get you all back together. We're doing it.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm hiding in the dark too because I'm crying. But I don't get to talk to you very often, but I appreciate your work every day. When I look at the archaeological collection. It's just an incredible place to work.
Trish?
Yes.
Yeah,
Hi,
this
Peter.
is Peter. Oh, good. Yeah, this is Peter Cook. And Trish, you and Matthew, I think, have hit the ball right out of the park. This is a very moving experience. There's an early picture in this wonderful commentary tonight that shows me with my arms around two boys. Stephen, a budding carpenter, historian, wonderful person on my left, and Tony Wood on my right. Both of them have made such incredible contributions. And to have Drayton Hall be the focal point of their dedication to historic preservation is indeed a real honor for me to see. Here I am on the eve of my 80th birthday, and I'm seeing something just very, very wonderful. And historic preservation is kind of paying forward with the whole Wood family and their ongoing legacy and contribution to a field that means so much and is so rich for all of us. I just really, really appreciate all the comments that, and hearing the names of colleagues from long ago played a role in this wonderful ongoing story at Drayton Hall. I just want to thank you so very much. It means such a great deal, I think, to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
I just want to say, if John can get a hold of my email, John, I'd very much like to get in touch and catch up with you.
Richard, I would like that very, very much.
Let's make it happen.
You were one of my favorite people in the whole 30 years of tenure there at Drayton Hall. You were the one who told me to make sure the water goes away. Move the water.
You were my eyes and ears on the property, so it's a mutual admiration here.
Well, I appreciated you so much, and you were, and Lynn, if you're still there, I so want to give you a hug.
Well, I'd give you one back.
You guys take care of yourselves, okay? And I'll be looking forward to that reunion.
Absolutely. We'll be there with bells.
If we can't do it at Drayton Hall, we can do it in my backyard.
Fair enough.
I got a few plants.
John, you said something to me that really stuck with me. I've shared it with a bunch of people, even though we didn't include it in this film. But you said you have 1,000 bad pictures of Drayton Hall.
And I do.
You come into work and it's just so stunning and you can't help yourself. You have to take a picture. And I think all of us have 1,000 bad pictures of Drayton Hall. And so I say we all get together and share our bad pictures with each other.
I've kept every one of them, and they're all upstairs in my little, I got a bookshelf full of photographs that are almost good.
Okay. Yes, almost anyway. Good. It's hard to take a bad picture.
And one or two real gems.
Well, I've made a note to connect John and Richard. I have a reminder if anyone else wants to know how to get in touch with anyone else, just let me know.
Put me on that list for John, please.
Okay. And Lynn. Okay, done. All right, everyone.
I'm gonna go
Time for cocktails.
I'm gonna go watch Jeopardy now.
Okay.
Y'all take care of yourselves, okay?
All right. Thank you, everyone.
How do we get a copy of this later on? Can you send us a copy later on?
Yes, we will figure out how to make that happen.
Excellent. I gotta be on the list. Thank you.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Carter,
All
take
right.
care.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.